This week on Just Solutions. The month of October saw wave after wave of strikes breaking out across the US as workers in multiple industries demand better pay, better benefits and better working conditions. This comes at a time when millions of Americans are leaving the workforce in what is being dubbed the Great Resignation. Corporate America is calling it a labour shortage, but labour rights activists say instead it's a shortage of good wages, affordable childcare and adequate benefits. And they say workers have had enough. Our guest today is economist Dr. Grieve Chelwa, Director of Research at the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, Grieve, it is great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, what is your analysis of what is happening right now with Labour, the recent strikes, but also the millions of workers who have just stepped away from the workforce, and the connection maybe between the two, because so many people are saying what's happening right now is in some ways an unofficial general strike, people refusing to go back into work that has low wages and bad benefits.
Thanks for having me. It's a unique pleasure for me to be on your show. I think you are framing it correctly. I mean, what we certainly do know that over the last couple of decades, the typical US worker has lost out on productivity improvements, right? So the share of income accruing to corporations has increased while the share accruing to the typical worker certainly declined. And I think what we've been seeing the last couple of weeks is a culmination of that sort of long structural process. So certainly, I think the typical worker is on solid ground in trying to ask for more benefits, because it's quite clear that the trend of the last couple of decades has been to the advantage of corporations and to the disadvantage of workers.
And, to emphasize that point, it seems that the terms, the health of our economy used to be equated with, say, wages and how well people were living. Right now, though, when we hear about the economy, it's really equated with, well, how are shares doing and what are shareholders doing? And we're seeing money, instead of being trickled down, profits from corporations like Amazon, that money, those profits are not going to workers, they're instead going to shareholders.
You're quite right about that. I think, all the way up until 1970, if you look at a chart of increase in or trends in wages for the typical worker, one saw real wages, so those wages adjusted for cost of living, going up lockstep with increases in productivity. But in the 1970s, there was a complete disconnect. All the benefits were accruing to corporations, and then benefits to workers, the real wages were going down. And you're right. And that's really an ideological shift whereby we began to equate the performance of the economy with how well the stock market is doing, how well the big corporations are doing, and not with how well the typical worker is doing. And that's all an ideological shift. So we need to go back to that moment pre-1970s, where really when we began to talk about the health of the economy, we essentially meant how well the typical worker is doing.
Well, your work at the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School really takes a look at structural inequalities and ways to promote equity. So if we were to look at what's happening right now with Labour, and in the context of what's been happening over the past few decades with Labour, how do structural inequalities, particularly around race, play into that?
Yes, so basically, one cannot talk about the US economy without alluding to race, right? I think everybody knows that sort of, one can talk about the original sin of the United States, which is really sort of racialized slavery, right? And even when we talk about the health of the typical worker, often that really is aggregated to not talk about race. So certainly structural inequalities are a typical feature of the US economy, be they by race, be there by gender or intersections thereof. And I think this was made really clear. I mean, it has always been clear, but vividly so during the pandemic recession, right, where we saw the impacts of the pandemic itself from the health side, where the brunt was borne mostly by workers of color, black women particularly. And we also saw essential workers, the category that we came to call essential workers. That category was mostly dominated by people of color who had a disproportionate risk of contracting COVID, as it were. So one cannot certainly talk about the US economy without being very clear about structural inequalities and sort of inequalities by race and gender.
And of course, the pandemic really shone a spotlight on the existing inequalities, as you said there, that have been pervasive in US society. And yet we did see rhetoric, certainly at the early stages of the pandemic, about hailing and praising those frontline workers, those essential workers. Some corporations gave what was quite modest raises at that time. That did not last long. And in terms of how we're still thinking about those essential workers, they haven't reaped the benefits really from that shift in attitude, from that recognition that they are essential workers. They're not seeing that in any type of monetary compensation.
That's true. And I mean, the thing is that we cannot use temporary voluntary solutions on the part of corporations to resolve structural inequalities or structural problems that have taken centuries, right? That have been formed over centuries. This really requires a structural rethinking about how we organize the economy, about how you said it very nicely there, about how we measure the health of the economy. So certainly we should not be relying on voluntary actions on the part of corporations that have been pretty responsible, A, for entrenching these racialized inequalities, B, for really reaping the disproportionate productivity gains. This really requires policy to change the structure of our economy. This really requires policy to change how our economy works and how we think about, when we say that the economy is growing, the economy is healthy, this really needs a change in how we do all these kinds of things. So we certainly cannot rely on voluntary, temporary measures on the part of corporations. This is really a policy issue.
Well, in terms of policy, of course, the Build Back Better Act has been endlessly debated and changed in so many ways, particularly when it comes to workers' rights. And we'll talk about the parental leave aspect of that. But your colleague at the Institute of Race and Political Economy at the New School, economist Derek Hamilton, a year ago, he co-authored a paper called Economic Rights as Industrial Policy. And it basically made the argument that family care policies must be part of a transformation in the economy. And that transformation must center workers at the heart of policy as opposed to corporations. We're still not seeing that. This will they, won't they approach around parental leave. It looks like maybe the Democrats will get it back into the Build Back Better bill, but who knows the fate of that. We're still not seeing a worker-centered approach when it comes to policies around the economy.
And that's very true. Again, it's part of a long-run trend, right? And what my colleague Derek the argument he was trying to make in that piece is that industrial policy historically, at least over the last 30 or 40 years, has always been to the advantage of corporations, right? So basically, we give corporations tax breaks, tax incentives, all sorts of incentives. We bail them out when they're in trouble, all these kinds of things. But nobody does something quite similar for workers. I mean, the extent of the subsidies and tax incentives and tax cuts that we've given corporations over the last 3 decades, for example, the workers have gotten nothing quite as close as that. And the argument that my colleague was making in that piece is that industrial policy should not center corporations, should center workers, right? What we do know is that, the original argument for centering corporations was that it would trickle down. But we've got 3 decades of evidence to show that, advantaging corporations only serves to advantage them further. And doesn't sort of trickle down to the workers. So we have to have a new conception of industrial policy that centers workers in the way that you described: childcare, paid parental leave. We should think about housing in one way, at least a minimum standard for housing, or a minimum amount of housing, or perhaps even a right to housing. We should think about healthcare. We should think about food. All these kinds of things that really center workers in that as a right thing to do from a moral point of view. But it also turns out, unlike the argument for industrial policy centering corporations, when you center workers, the economy is much more healthy. It grows even more.
Well, Dan, who's watching right now on YouTube, says, well, we should also be centering workers when it comes to ownership and that employee-owned business. When the workers are actually getting part of the profits in a percentage, there's more of an incentive around quality and commitment to the organization. And of course, we're seeing a growing movement, not just in the US, but certainly internationally. In fact, I think it's even greater in other countries around cooperative models of ownership. Do you see this as a point where that type of cooperative ownership leadership could really have either a resurgence, because I know we have had them in the past, or just this could be the moment that we see that type of economic model.
I mean, so I'm not. Look, one has to be optimistic. Hopefully, this is the moment. But I think to get to that, we have to organize. We have to strategize. Those of us who really believe in centering workers and workers' rights have to organize in that direction. But you're right. These models of cooperatives, stakeholder capitalism. I think Germany is a typical case where one sees this particular model where workers are represented on the boards of corporations. Workers really form a part of the strategic direction of companies. That's a moral right thing to do. Morally, it's the right thing to do because workers contribute a lot to a company's bottom line. But like the colleague who's watching said, it also aligns incentives in such a way that we're all in this together. So we're going to work together to get this company surviving, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree certainly with your contributor there.
Are we seeing a response from corporations to this mass resignation and this, what we're calling really an unofficial general strike, people moving themselves just completely out of the workforce, or indeed the strikes that we're seeing around the country? Are corporations responding, or business owners responding with actually increasing wages and increasing benefits?
I mean, there's been some sort of isolated instances where some corporations are realizing that they need to increase wages. But I think the dominant narrative is that there's a labor shortage. So I think corporations are framing this as a whole. They're framing this as a labor shortage, which is to say that, our wages are okay. It's just that there's not enough workers out there to take up this particular jobs. So certainly we're not seeing sort of a mass response from corporations. But again, this I think should be a public policy issue. I don't think we should always, and that's the thing, we always try to think, okay, the onus is on the corporation. The corporation should do something. The corporation should give back. But I think this should be a public policy issue. Like the government really needs to steer the ship and say, look, these resignations are a result of workers feeling that they're being left behind. And the only way to get this compact between capital and labor back to where it once was is to offer better pay, better benefits, and we're going to legislate it in that direction.
Well, we're talking really about what's happening here in the US, but of course, the economy here, we're part of a globalized economy, and workers' rights here, we're also seeing issues with workers' rights in other countries. And many of those workers are feeding the capitalist economy here in the US, whether it's manufacturing or, other sectors. So we are all connected. So what's happening in other parts of the world? Are we seeing similar patterns in labor?
I mean, so the US is rather atypical in many senses, right? So one of the things that we know in the US is that over the last couple of decades, the rate of unionization, sort of membership to unions, has declined, right? So, and then because of that, one sees what's been happening the last couple of weeks as a reaction to that. I think workers realize the benefits of getting together, organizing. And in the rest of the world, we still have union membership rates that are healthy. I mean, they're much lower than they were a couple of decades back, but still not as low as they're in the US. So we're not seeing this kind of mass reaction that one sees in the US, which is rather stark. Also, it's also with raising here that in other parts of the world, in particular Western Europe, we saw that in those countries, because of strong union membership, because of the sort of the idea of social democracies there, we did see governments there do quite a bit. Already there were enough protections for workers in place, but even during the pandemic, governments really did do their part to maintain the health and the well-being of workers. In Africa, for example, where I'm from, the pandemic did not hit as hard as it did in the US. So again, you don't see those kinds of scenarios playing themselves out. But you're very right that across the world, because of the destruction of the neoliberal era of the last 30, 40 years, certainly there's a resurgence of folks calling for much more workers' rights, for increasing the welfare of workers, for workers claiming a much bigger stake in the generation of income, much of which has gone to corporations, transnational corporations, multinational corporations, and that kind of thing. So I would agree with you from that point of view.
Of course, it's always worth remembering when we discuss US labor rights and movement and compare them to other industrialized nations, This country does not have universal health care. It does not have the social welfare systems that are existing in similar industrialized countries. You know, if you look at the Scandinavian countries and the childcare model that they have, it's so much more affordable. Of course, education is so much more affordable in those other countries too. And these are very much connected to workers' rights, because when you have a workforce that is not earning enough to afford to pay for healthcare or indeed send their kids to college, you know, that has a ripple effect, not just within that family, but through generations.
Yeah, very right. I mean, the US is surprisingly atypical when one looks at the chart of industrialized countries and one looks at some of the things that you just illustrated. It's very striking just how atypical the US is, especially given that it's, you know, it's the richest country in the world, the biggest GDP and that kind of thing. But the richest country in the world does very little for workers. Its most essential resource, which is its people, it does very little to give back to its people. And I mean, this causes quite lots of anxieties. I mean, if you're a head of household, you know, you're working a minimum wage job or a lowly paid wage, and then the pandemic strikes, this creates lots of anxiety, lots of dislocations, and it doesn't create for, you know, for an economy, a solidarity economy where everybody feels like they belong. And I think that's the next step. That's the direction in which the US should follow. The US should look towards its peers, the rest of the industrialized world, to see basically how production distribution is organized. I think that's the model.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching and your thoughts on this. Maybe you're part of the Great Resignation, this unofficial general strike, or some of the strikes that we are seeing playing out around the country. Jerry, who's watching on YouTube, says a worker-centered focus is the anathema to capitalism, which seems to, of course, make sense. But we are seeing more and more of these worker-centered models in maybe other countries and potentially emerging here. Well, Grieve, I would like to talk a little bit about your work around decolonizing economies, because this is an area you have done a lot of research on. What does that actually mean when it comes to the US and the issues that we brought up earlier, the fact that there is so much inequality, particularly when it comes to race, that's just baked into every part of society here, but particularly the economy. When you're talking about decolonizing the economy, what does that mean here in the US?
I mean, so I think it's, yeah, that's a good question. I think so. My work is really about decolonizing the discipline itself, which is sort of economics, which studies the economy, and maybe the two are certainly related. But I think the point that one would make, especially in the U.S. context, is to say, you know, economics as a discipline has to tell a factual story of history, right? So, for example, in the US context, we've lots of stories about how the US became to be such an economic might, such a capitalist behemoth, or the origins of US capitalism, right? Traditionally, the economics discipline has, you know, has used, for example, words like US ingenuity of Americans, ingenuity of sort of the initial industrialists, you know, efficiency, innovation, etc., etc. But a decolonized retelling of U.S. might, in terms of as far as the economy is concerned, would have to grapple with the role of racialized slavery, right? So, in the U.S. context, and generally anywhere else, this call for for decolonizing economics is really calling for us to be factual when we teach our students as teachers, when we write our books and write our papers, because that also has implications on policy, right? Once one has a proper retelling of U.S. history and the role of racialized slavery, hopefully that helps in how we think about how do we then design an economy going forward that's much more inclusive. So maybe that's exactly what decolonizing economics means from the US context and even elsewhere.
Well, right now in Glasgow, COP26 is happening, and we have world leaders, well, from most countries who were there trying to find a way through the climate crisis. And when we're talking about labour, of course, the climate crisis impacts everything, but of course, labour. And as we talk about a transition away from the fossil fuel-based economies, but also moving then towards sustainable economies, what about decolonizing the green movement? I mean, how do we keep all of these ideas that you've been talking about to really have to center workers when we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, but also to have these inequalities that we have talked about and the colonialist roots of so many of industrial economies? How do we tackle all of that when we're looking at the climate crisis when it comes to labor?
That's a good question. So a decolonized sort of analysis of the problem would, for example, require for us to first of all understand what got us to where we are today, right? And much of that is, like you rightly put it, the rise of Western capitalism has been powered by exploitation of labor, right? Internally and externally, via colonialism, imperialism, also exploitation of the things we're trying to get rid of now, exploitation of coal, exploitation of oil, etc., etc. So first of all, we would have to grapple with that, because then it's got implications for the kind of policies we design going forward, right? So one thing that necessitates is basically necessitates that any policy proposals going forward, the just transition or the brunt of the just transition should not fall on countries that didn't exploit in this particular way, be it either natural resources and labor. That's one way of looking at it. Again, a decolonized analysis would require that we think about, right, if we're going to transition, as we're doing this just transition towards renewables, we have to be careful to not replicate the inequalities of before. And it's very easy to do that, right? Because one then would say, who's at the center of driving this transition towards renewables, right? It would be corporations, right? For example, Wall Street is very happy, and Wall Street is singing this song of a just transition. But we have to be very careful, because a just transition also requires resource exploitation. It requires lithium-powered batteries. It requires, electric cars. These things require natural resources, many of which are produced in what we call the global south countries. So again, if we're not very careful, if we don't approach these things in a very careful way, we might then again replicate the inequalities of before, exploitation of labor, etc., even when we've just transitioned towards renewables. So I think that's what I would say. I mean, a decolonized analysis of the problem would require that we think about how we got to this point. Again, we think about how we organize our economies today globally, and then we say we shouldn't replicate these inequalities going forward, because a just transition requires natural resources. It requires, copper, it requires cobalt, it requires lithium, and all sorts of these kinds of things. And if we're not very careful, the exploitation of these resources that are the bedrock of a just transition will replicate the inequalities of before.
The climate crisis, of course, is driving migration, and that's only going to increase as the years go forward. We're already seeing the results of that, certainly at the southern border of the US, when we're seeing people who are displaced. Farming land in so many parts of the world is just not working anymore, and people are on the move, and we're going to see, as I said, that more and more and more. Migration policy is very much related to labor. The two things are interchangeable, really, in many ways, in many policies. So what is your sense of the intersection of those three things, the climate crisis, migration, and labor? Are you seeing enough discussion of the intersectionality of those three elements? Because so often we're seeing them discussed completely separately, but of course they really are so connected.
You're very right. I think when I look around, I don't see them sort of discussed in that interconnected way. Often we're thinking about the climate crisis will lead to large-scale migration. What can we do to stop that, right? So one option is, do we police the borders? I don't think that's a very satisfactory policy response to the problem. One can do, again, if we think about how we got to this moment, is that exploitation of resources and labor by the North historically. So one can think about reparations, right, being paid to those countries that are now bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, one option. But you're right. Basically, we ought to discuss this triage, as you put it, together to see the interconnection between the climate crisis, migration, and labor issues. Because it's pretty important. Because even when people manage from the South, the global South, to move northwards, right? Are we ensuring that they're migrating into occupations where they have enough rights? They're protected from exploitation. They have benefits. Their children are taken care of. Those kinds of things. So you're very right that we have to discuss them in tandem and not as separate, isolated issues.
And it does seem as well then that it should not just be, say, policymakers that are paying attention to how those issues intersect, that civil society needs to. So maybe more discussion about labour rights from environmental movements, or maybe more discussion on immigration issues from labour movements, and to see a cross-pollination of all of those advocacy efforts. I mean, is that even happening? Is that something that you're seeing?
No, I'm not seeing much of that happening. I think the climate crisis issue is currently being framed as an environmental issue, right? An environmental rights issue, an environmental justice issue. But I think you're right. Part of that discussion has to think about what it means for labor, because, right, workers rely on the environment. If the environment is not healthy, then workers suffer, especially in large swaths of the world. So you're very right. We're not seeing that kind of discussion right now. But I think that's the direction in which that discussion should proceed.
Well, there is a new jobs report expected out this week. So, what's your sense of where we're going to see all of this labour movement going? I mean, are we going to see more people stepping back into the labour force? Are we going to see ongoing strikes? Do you have a sense of where this is going?
I mean, I don't have a sense of where it's going, but I'm encouraged by the trends. I'm encouraged by these trends because now an agency. There's an agency on the workers have agency, right? To be able to say, I will not settle for a minimum wage job that's going to work me to death, right? And the kind of way we've organized our economies over the last 44 decades or so has almost given workers no choice, right? Either I work or not. I mean, I have no choice but to work. But I'm encouraged by these trends, especially in the US, where rates of unionization are pretty low. I'm encouraged by workers taking a step back and saying we demand more. I think part of this is may have been a reset during the coronavirus moment. People had an opportunity to introspect. That's one way, but also there was this realization, right, that look, corporations are getting so much. They've been getting so much out of this situation for the last couple of decades. I think it's time that we ask for more ourselves. So I'm encouraged by these trends. I hope the trends continue. I mean, one cannot see where they go. I hope corporations get it, but then again, I don't want to live. This is not an issue for corporations to solve. This is an issue for public policy, right? Policymakers need to solve this issue. If we leave it to corporations, we're going to have a temporary solution. What we need is a permanent solution, so that we create economies that are inclusive, that work for the typical worker. Yeah,
And workers at the centre of economic policy.
I agree. Exactly.
Well, Grieve Chelwa, thank you so much for being with us on Just Solutions.
Thank you so much for asking me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Well, don't forget that you can catch Just Solutions as a podcast. Listen anytime, listen to back episodes, subscribe to Just Solutions wherever you get your podcasts. And tune in next week, where we're going to be looking at forests. The issue of deforestation has been discussed at COP26. We're going to speak with a scientist who has been studying forests and why they are such an important part of the environment, and how they can give us clues how we can potentially weather the climate crisis. That's next week, same time, same place, from Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.